Hi, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Milwaukee Rising with Technically. I'm Sorrina Beecher, the lead reporter for the region, and every week we feature an individual or group that is shaping Milwaukee's economic landscape and also highlighting solutions to help build a more equitable and inclusive future. This week, we're talking to Dr. Rhoan Garnett, who recently joined the Milwaukee Public Museum as its first Director of Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility, also known as IDEA, at a time when the institution is examining its history and reimagining its course for the future. Welcome, Dr. Garnett. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Sorrina. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for joining us. And I have to admit, I'm a little bit biased this week because the Milwaukee Public Museum is one of my absolute favorite places to be. And just this week, the museum received some pretty big news. Do you want to share the milestone Milwaukee Public Museum reached this week?
Yeah, well, there was the $45 million was approved for the future museum. About that, I just want to say I'm incredibly proud of the Wisconsin people invested in the future of the Wisconsin Public Museum. I think it's incredibly important because a public museum is the cultural center of a community. And if we're going to create a sense of belonging for everyone, I think this is incredibly important. So investing in the future of Wisconsin, I think it's the right thing to do.
And your role is actually a brand new role for the Milwaukee Public Museum. Can you share with us a little bit about what you're responsible for?
Yeah, so it is a brand new role at the museum, and much of the role is to lead the sort of programmatic direction for the museum in centering that that strategic plan around community engagement and including diversity in all of the work that we do at the museum.
And what interested you in the role? Because you're not a Milwaukee native.
That's right. I think the way to probably answer this question, Serena, if you don't mind, is sort of backing into it. My journey took me from St. Thomas, the Virgin Islands, and I went off to college in Maine. And when I got to college, after the first year, essentially, it was a challenge in enrolling again. And so I decided to take some years off. Essentially, it took me 8 years to graduate with an undergraduate degree. But the experiences that I had in enrolling in college and stopping out and going back really set me up nicely to understand the challenges facing young people who are first generation college students in moving through the college going process. And so I also worked at Bowdoin after I graduated, Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine. And that experience was incredibly enlightening because I noticed that many of the students there who were students like me who were first gen, low-income students, those students were oftentimes enrolled at Bowdoin because of some sort of community-based organization. So the community had an incredible, important role in making sure that students were transitioning to college, that in spaces that weren't typically spaces that was built for students of color, students who were first gen. And I was really fascinated with how they were engaging with the campus community and also making sure that students were getting the support that they needed. And so I decided I wanted to understand a bit more about that. And so I went off to grad school at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I took on this understanding of what exactly community-based organizations were doing in supporting students. And in doing that work, I suddenly realized too that many of these organizations were serving a smaller population of students because it's an incredibly expensive undertaking. And so my role was then, or my task was to figure out how do we scale this for more students. And so the question about We Bridge Belonging, which is a company idea or organizational idea that came out of my doctoral work about how do we engage with campus communities to make sure that students are navigating the college process, they're getting the support that they need when they're actually enrolled on campus. And much of that is really I don't want to simplify it, but the gist of it is that we can create networks of mentoring for students. So oftentimes we are focused on the sort of individual one-on-one mentoring. And what it really should be is actually thinking about students in a network or surrounded by a network of mentors. And that sort of fits into the community engagement element as well, giving students sort of options and different people to talk to depending on what their interests might be. You know, you can imagine if a student were to come to me, we went to the same college, for example, Sorrina, and they ask you a question about the school, but then they had a question about a major that you doesn't have any sort of background in. And so you say, you know what, let me introduce you to my friend Rhoan. He majored in that topic. And then so suddenly that's a conversation. They might ask me something similar and I might just put them on to someone else. But it's creating that network for young people so that they can navigate spaces.
And when you came to the States, was your interest always in higher education?
No, it's my journey essentially, that what I just described to you, that experience that I had was sort of a natural draw to go into higher education. Like it's one of those things, not to make it to sound like this, but when you've experienced something that's really challenging and you begin to see the ways that you can actually do it better. For me, it was, you know what, I think it made sense for me to do this. To use that experience, to use that wisdom to help institutions do a better job in how they engage in students like me and how they're supporting students like me.
How did growing up in St. Thomas sort of shape your professional path, or how did that kind of influence the jump from even going from St. Thomas Island to Maine?
Yeah.
I mean, what was that like?
Yeah, I mean, that was it was a culture shock.
Sure.
It's so interesting. I mean, that even as I said that word out loud, even given the space that I'm in, it speaks to how culture is the foundation for everything. And when culture isn't identified, or you can't see yourself in a space, it creates all types of challenges. But it was a culture shock for me, and that was initially. But as I sort of navigated the space and met people in the space, I think it set me up to do a lot of the work that I'm doing. So I live not only in Maine, I also part of my high school years was spent in Oklahoma. And as I said, I went out to Washington State, and now here I am in the middle of the country. So I've lived in these four regions. And what it's allowed me to do is to show up in spaces oftentimes as the learner, as the facilitator. And that's exactly what my role here at MPM is to figure out, how do we talk to people who don't ordinarily speak to each other? How do we get people to show up to each other and actually listen? I've come to even learn for my own self how important it is to actually ask questions rather than making statements. And we live in a society where if I tell someone my experience and their experience happen to differ, it seems to become a conversation where someone has to win, right? And I always say that more than two things can be true. More than one thing can be true all at the same time. And it can be true that you had a particular experience, and it could also be true that I had a particular experience. And if we could actually sort of sit and have a conversation about those experiences, we'll see each other better. So much of my work was around bridge building, right? And so when I think of bridge building in the human sense, the relationship is the bridge, and it allows us to go in either direction. So I tell people all the time, those interpersonal relationships adds up to your network of relationship, but it's inside those interpersonal relationships that allow you to go in either direction. And when we go in either direction, that's when we can actually come back and have better understanding about things. And that's exactly what I'm actually hoping to do at the Public Museum in my role.
Absolutely. And the museum is such a great representation of stories and how history connects us all. It reveals our commonalities. So how how does that kind of play into your role? I mean, what are you looking to bring to the museum with this? Because it's a brand new role. It's the first time the museum has extended this position. You sort of, what's your vision for the role? What do you hope to
Yeah.
accomplish?
I mean, just to even say, just shout out to the MPM leadership for, even imagining this. And I know it's also the time, right? It's this needed to happen. And so I feel incredibly privileged, incredibly blessed to be the person who they chose to take on this role. But we're living now in a time when for many of us, it's an incredibly divisive time in our history, in our politics. Some of the social unrest that we're experiencing. Um, I think for us to actually sort of come together, what better place than to do that at a museum, right? To me, a museum is the center, the cultural center of a community. And when we have communities that are is segregated, and I don't think this comes as a surprise to anyone who's listening out there, right? I think one of the things that Milwaukee is known for is having one of the most segregated society or cities in the country. And I've been having conversation with folks, Sorrina, about this, and you can sometimes sense the defensiveness. And what I say to folks is, there's no reason to hide from it, right? Like just sort of lean into it. We already know this. This is out there in the public. Is what are we going to do? What are we going to do about it? And I think working at a museum is one of the ways that we can actually do that work. I think all communities can be housed peacefully under the museum. And I think right now, what we see is, I think there's some spaces where I think folks or some communities don't think they're necessarily represented in the museum. And so this role is specifically intended to reach out to communities who haven't seen themselves represented in the museum, or just even in the conversations about what should happen at the museum. And this is a conversation that we're even having on the inside, where this position begins sort of inside out. How do we actually deal with the challenges that we face on the inside, where departments, and it happens all the time, it happens across organizations where departments oftentimes are operating in silos, right? So how do we actually be a bit more inclusive on the inside of as well, collaborated in our work? That's where I think the real impact happens. It's at the intersection of our work. Again, the whole bridge concept. If we could understand how the other side is doing things, we might have a sort of a larger vision of how we can do our work better. So some of my work right now is just even trying to build a strategic plan where I'm framing goals and questions to ask departments, like, what does ideal look like in your work right now? And if it's not present in your work, what do you want it to look like in your work? For example, if we're talking to marketing, it might be that, Rhoan, we don't typically see students of color or Black students or students of the North Side engaging with the information that we put out in spaces. So how are we going to resolve that and do a better job at that? And so that's a lot of the work. Is just it's collaboration and it's facilitating conversations to make sure that everyone's voices are heard.
Yeah, and I want to jump back for just a second, because you did a lot of research in the space of higher education, of using the community as a bridge to help students, first-gen students, lower income students, kind of come into the world of higher ed. How does that sort of run in parallel with your role now? Are you reaching out to community members? Are you reaching out to schools? Can you just give a little bit more information on that?
Yeah, I mean, so in my doctoral work, that work was centering the community engagement element. So through those community-based organizations, one of the things that I realized right away in all the spaces that I operated in was that these organizations weren't necessarily institutionalized. And when I say that, I mean there weren't actually data points in data sets on campus. So I think in many cases, I'm not sure that schools understood, exactly how many students were coming from particular places. And if they did, I'm not sure how often they were in conversations with communities. My sense in working in spaces was that oftentimes the community had to take it upon themselves to actually reach out. So this role, I come into this role with that information, understanding the importance of the museum doing a lot of that work of actually reaching out to communities, as opposed to making it so that we always have to come, to the museum. So it's very much sort of like social network analysis. We're understanding who all of the audiences are and how we actually want to engage with them. That's the work that I did as a doctoral student in my research, and that's the work that I'm going to bring here. And it's just community engagement and engaging all the voices.
And what's sort of at risk if we, the Milwaukee Public Museum, like a lot of institutions are sort of redefining what it means to be more inclusive. What is the risk of not taking those steps? I mean, why is this so vital to the community and to the museum?
Well, I think I said this to begin with. It feeds into the divisiveness that we see in our politics, right? I mean, if we have communities, and I've noticed this, where if we have communities that are isolated, and we have communities that are sort of oftentimes the voice for everyone else, there's some bulldozering that's happening there, right? And so I think it's really important, at least for me, to bring people into spaces, just to have these conversations. Segregation as a tool, as an instrument, was essentially set up to divide and conquer. And I think that's really the best way to put it. And so if we understand it in that sense, then we understand how important it is to actually be more inclusive, right? It's a simple thing as just it means to bring us together to have a more collective community.
Yeah, and just leaning on your own experience as a person of color, as a person who came from St. Thomas, what have been some of the challenges that you've experienced that you sort of hold close to your own, the way that you want to get this out into the community or want to bring, more inclusive practices to your work?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say about
It's a lot
this,
to
but
unpack, right?
yeah, but I mean, I think as a first generation college students, but I'm also, and I'll just be very direct, I'm also a Black man in this country, and so you're constantly dealing with the stereotyping, and then sometimes even in cases like with me is you hear, I've had people might meet me, and I sound like I can string my sentences together. I sound like I can make sense. And what's interesting is it's really simple. And I've met a lot of people who look like me, who are incredibly smarter than I am. But it's interesting when people will say stuff like, you're different. And I've had to deal with that as well, where I'm not exactly sure what that means, right? But it's the constant, almost sort of having to show up in spaces and being exceptional. It's showing up in spaces and having to represent everyone that looks like me. So I'm not even going to be shy about saying this, Sorrina. It's sometimes it's incredibly exhausting. But what I'll also say is that for someone who's moved through spaces and moved through several spaces now, in the long run, it's a blessing, right? It's the thing that allows me to show up to a number of different kind of people, different groups of people, because I've actually essentially lived it all. I mentioned that, I came from St. Thomas. I came from incredibly humble beginnings, even before that, in St. Kitts. And I made my way to Bowdoin College, which is one of the wealthiest institutions in the country, and I managed to find my way to a PhD program, and graduated with essentially my dissertation got attention. But what I say to folks all the time, that degree, it's in one sense the academic sense, but really I really got a degree in just understanding the human experience, and that's why I think like I'm a really good fit for this role, and that's why I'm incredibly excited about this role. My colleagues at NPM constantly talk about, Rhoan, this need for us to center the human experience, right? And I see myself as someone who is essentially a chief experience officer. Man, I have a rich life experience where I've lived through a lot of different challenges as someone who's first gen, someone who is low income, and someone who's a Black man just sort of moving through an incredibly sometimes racist society. And that racism, what I mean by that, is not necessarily explicit racism, but a lot of those sort of subtle, unconscious things that we put on folks. And we see this actually too, Sorrina, even in the museum, and we are doing some of that work right now around case and labels, where we're dealing with some insensitive language. And that's not just me saying that. That's community members or visitors to the museum who's coming through and experience the exhibits and writing back to us and saying, I think you guys need to do something about some of the language in the space. But what I love about my colleagues, there's no one that I've worked with so far who seemed like they're surprised or even offended by it. It's like, no, this is evidence, and people are telling us how to do our work better. And that's part of what I want to do. I mean, I've actually proposed, how do we actually put it out there where we create a forum of some sort where people can just sort of chime in. And so we know in real time the things that we could actually improve upon.
Sure. What do you think it is about you or your personality or your drive that kind of keeps you motivated in those spaces where it can feel defeating, and like you said, it can be exhausting? What keeps you going?
You're asking some really good questions. For not to sound like cheesy about it, but I do this for those young people I grew up with. I tell people this all the time, that what I quickly realized when I got to college was I'd already met some of the smartest people I will ever know, and that didn't show up in academics. I had a friend who can pop your trunk and tell your hood and tell you what was wrong with your car, and never went to school for being a mechanic. He also was a carpenter, a mason. I mean, just an incredibly talented human being, but didn't have the guidance to help him actually fully realize build those skills and those talents. And for me, I sit in my work every day. When I want to be reminded, I just think about those people who I came of age with, and I owe a tremendous debt. And I tell people that my community, there's some folks who might look in and say, grew up rough and that sort of thing. But I can't be Rhoan, and I'm not here unless I had some of the friends I grew up with who were making sure that I stayed on the right path, that that I did the things that I was supposed to do. And so when I show up in space, and now I'm in Wisconsin, like I want to find those people who remind me of those young people I grew up with. I can't really do a whole lot right now for those folks, because I mean, they're much older, but they've had kids, and that's really my motivation, is to figure out how do we try to make it easier for young people to move through spaces, man, because I think sometimes it's unnecessarily challenging.
Inspiring the next generation.
Long-winded.
Okay, so now a moment of levity. You've been in Milwaukee now for a couple of months. What have you enjoyed about the city? What do you do when you're not busy conquering the museum and helping the community kind of form a bridge?
Yeah, it's I'll say this. I arrived here and met someone who is a native of Milwaukee. So I'm dating someone who is, who's a local, and so
Okay.
that's a blessing. And I should also just to give a shout out to the people who've created a community here for me. I wrote a bit of my dissertation in 2018. I had a personal um, incident in my life, and so I was then I was welcomed by some friends of mine who I met back in Maine to say, "Rhoan, you can come here and you can hang out." So next thing you know, I was here for 3 months writing what would be essentially the final chapter of my dissertation. During that time, they introduced me to their group of friends, and these folks have been incredibly kind um, to me. And so when I actually came back here to visit, and I met Amelia, who's uh, my girlfriend. It was like this thing of like, why is everyone here so so nice? In fact, I thought it was a part of me was like, this is some sort of trap. This is some sort of everyone is so nice. But Amelia would take me. I mean, we went to like places like Grafton.
Mhm.
Uh,
I'm from there.
yeah, and people like I was just amazed by that, how people were so friendly. One of the places that we go a lot is Port Washington. And the first time I went to Port Washington, it felt right, Sorrina, in the sense that I don't know a time in my life that I wasn't near water, right? Like I was born and I went home to a house where I looked out the back door and the shore was right there. I moved to Maine. I moved to Washington. And so when I went to Port Washington, it just made sense. And I tell people all the time, and I think sometimes it's surprising to folks, but Port Washington is easily one of my most favorite places to go in Wisconsin. In fact, I've sometimes gone there just and spend the weekend because I feel a sense of that sense of belonging
Yeah.
in the space. But it's my connection to the natural environment, if you will, that makes me feel connected to it.
Well, I certainly love to hear that as someone who actually spent their life in Port Washington, Saukville, Grafton. So
Yeah.
I'm happy to hear that. Also have that strong connection to water.
I joke, Serena. I tell people I'll become the first Black mayor of Port Washington. So, Wisconsin, listen up.
I love it. I love it. Love to see that area grow. Well, I just want to thank you for this conversation. Very excited to speak with you. I know a lot of people in the city are very excited about the work you're doing and the work that you're planning to do in the future. A lot of people are excited about the future of the museum with all the changes you guys are kind of undertaking. And if you guys want to continue this conversation, it doesn't have to end right here. We'll actually be posting a recap of our conversation with Dr. Garnett, and we will also be posting a story that will appear in our next weekly newsletter. So if you want to subscribe to This Week in Milwaukee Rising, you simply just have to visit technically/subscribe. And thank you again for your time, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.